Hello, everyone. Welcome to HyperDocs Live. We are so excited if you're tuning in live or watching this later. Thanks for joining us. I'm Kelly Hilton. I'm here with Lisa Highfill and Sarah Landis and our special guest, Brian Goodwin, today. Good morning.
Morning.
So today we are going to be talking about learning that sticks, and Brian Goodwin is our expert on learning that sticks, as he is the author of the brain-based model of lesson design and delivering book. So we are going to get an opportunity to talk to him today and learn from him. But let's just start with, why is this so exciting, Lisa and Sarah, to have like the guru here on our HyperDocs channel talking about learning that sticks?
Well, I'm so excited because we are constantly talking about this as teachers. We are obviously reflecting on a lesson, and we're trying to think about, what is that moment in that lesson that you saw the light bulb go off? What is that activity? What did I ask them to do that caused that sticky piece? And you can just see it happening. And to go back and analyze that lesson, as a lesson plan geek, I love doing that with teachers. So I cannot wait to hear everything Brian has to share about that, because it's one of my favorite pieces. So as a HyperDoc designer, you could start purposefully designing those sticky pieces into your lessons. So
yeah, this is a dream come true to have you with us today, because I was actually reflecting back to when I got my master's at Teachers College, and we talked so much about transfer and independence as kind of like two fundamentals of knowing whether or not a child has learned something on their own to go forth and have it stick, right? And just thinking about, like, what is it? How do we know when it's sticky? What are the tricks? And that's our goal as educators, like in so many ways, to inspire kids in a way that they learn it because they want to, and that they can transfer that information to the rest of other parts of their lives, but that they become independent and hold on to that learning for themselves, not for us. So just thinking back to kind of the roots of like my, master's program, and just thinking about, it's like one of our core reasons why we teach. And so I'm excited to look into our role as the educator and making that experience happen for kids.
You said it, Sarah. I mean, we live for those moments. We live for watching that light bulb. Lisa mentioned it too. That is what brings us back into drive and to work with the kids. And if you haven't seen it yet, you're trying to create a condition to get that spark, to get that light bulb on for every student in your class. And that's what HyperDoc designers are all about. But there is research and science behind it. And Brian has so much to share with us, because if you've ever taught a lesson and wondered, why do I have to keep teaching this over and over and over again? And I feel like Groundhog's Day, Lisa. I keep saying to myself, why? I already said this. Then maybe it's time to take a moment, reflect on your design, learn from what Brian's going to teach us, and HyperDoc that lesson. So we're going to start with the research, and then we're going to move into some specific examples. But I first want to tell you a little more about Brian. Brian is the president and CEO of McREL International. And McREL is a Denver-based nonprofit educational research and development organization. So he's also a former teacher and a journalist, but now he's running McREL. So Brian, we're so happy to have you here. Thank you, and welcome, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, I'm thrilled to be here. As you mentioned, so I'm president and CEO at McREL International. We're headquartered in Denver, but we have staff all over the place, all across the Pacific, and we do work all around the world. Our mission has always been transforming schools by using research, and so we really think of ourselves as focused on teaching, learning, and leading. We think those are three key leverage points for creating awesome learning experiences for kids, and that's really what we focus on. And this idea of like creating a positive education experience for every kid that nurtures them, that helps them become motivated intrinsically, right? That helps them develop curiosity, that helps them have a locus of control, feel like they're in control of their worlds. And you do that by creating classrooms like what we were describing, right? Where kids can have that transfer and independence. And then helping schools become learning organizations, because we talk a lot about student curiosity. Well, teachers, deserve to be curious too, right? So how can we create professional learning experiences that that reflect kind of what we want for our kids, that are inquiry focused, that let teachers really understand research and evidence-based practice. But then what does it mean for my kids in my classroom? And so we, like I said, we're a nonprofit. We do a lot of research work. We also do a lot of technical assistance, technical support work, professional learning, all that kind of stuff. And so when we first met, I was also thrilled to see the work that you guys are doing at HyperDocs, which is making very practical, very applicable, a lot of things that we've been talking about for years around effective instructional practices.
Yes.
So I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you so much for being here. Yes, full disclosure, I met Brian by attending a webinar where he was teaching about learning that sticks. And as he was sharing the research, I was thinking, man, this is what happens when I create a really good HyperDoc and I see that happening. So it was validating some of the work. So at McCrell, people can check it out. There's a blog. We'll drop it in the chat. He also has like a ton of resources there. And they just published a beautiful, like, it's an 8-part series you're working on right now on this blog, where you can find a lot of great resources. The top one here is around online PD. And this really aligns with HyperDocs too. I mean, how we are creating a space to learn online, but that learning is still social was one of the takeaways. Am I right, Brian?
That's absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, good learning is always nested inside communities of practice.
Yes. Agreed. And that's what our community, what we're trying to build in our community as well. But and then there's making learning stick with remote learners, which people might want to check out as well, because as we're working with teachers all the time, how do we apply this to our new learning environment, which is what we're in right now? Very different learning environment. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about your book, Learning Sticks, and where it started, where you got the inspiration to write it. You have 2 co-authors.
Mm-hmm.
You know that it's focused on unpacking like the cognitive science and research that supports effective lesson design. So I'm curious, what brought you on this journey to write that book?
Yeah, well, some of it started as being a teacher myself and having those moments where you're like, why am I repeating myself? Or I feel like I've turned into Ben Stein from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. What's happening? How do I engage kids better? And a lot of it started with this notion of engagement, that we all know when kids are intrinsically motivated, learning is more joyful and effective for them, and more joyful for us as teachers too. And I think a lot of it, though, Kelly, started with one of the books that we published, and we've actually got a new edition coming out in a year. What's Classroom Instruction That Works? And so we have been doing a lot of work helping teachers apply those practices, right? Those 9 high leverage strategies that you're probably familiar with, like similarities and differences, cooperative learning. And so I do remember a moment where I was touring a classroom. It doesn't really matter where, because it could have been anywhere. But I saw teachers using cooperative learning, but then it hit me that they were earnest in what they were doing. But it was like this. What they had were kids that were like basically in a little pod together reading a textbook. And I thought, I don't think that's cooperative learning, but I don't think that's really where cooperative learning fits in, like as you're encountering new knowledge. But then here's the real epiphany. It hit me, oh my gosh, I think I used to do that as a teacher too, right? Mm-hmm. I wouldn't really know why I was doing what I was doing. It was just, well, I should mix things up. I'm going to do some cooperative learning today. It's Wednesday, Mm-hmm. And so I think that was the starting point of saying, how can we help teachers become more intentional with what works? And that was always, as we were helping people use classroom instruction that works, it was always that moment of intentionality, or maybe metacognition, going meta with the practice and realizing why I'm doing what I'm doing. That is so powerful. So then that began the journey of, okay, well, if we can understand more about how learning works and how learning happens, then we can actually help teachers put together better learning design. And I think one of the key things about the book is that we've kind of flipped it. We've gone from, like, you'll see, and I'll describe the 6 phases in a moment, and what's maybe most important about them is they're written from the perspective of the student, right? It's not what am I doing as a teacher, but what do I want to have happening? What should be happening in students' minds right now? Mm-hmm. And that's what we're focused on. So it's kind of taking everything we know about good instructional practice, but then flipping and saying, but what does learning look like? And how can those instructional strategies nudge students towards deeper and deeper learning?
I love that. I cannot wait for you to dive into the 6 phases. And I do want to acknowledge what you said around the cooperative groups. I can totally relate to that, especially as a newer teacher. You feel like I need to do this because it's the right thing, or what? But what does that really look like to really apply the experience? Or is it substitution, or is it really going to transform the learning? And as we even are looking at designing and integrating technology, we ask ourselves that question too. Like, is it time to use technology or not?
Right.
You know? I mean, so when you really understand these phases and you understand technology and your curriculum and pedagogy, because teachers are amazing and they have to really be creative on how to understand all of them, then you can make powerful lessons, I believe.
Yeah, I think one of our other guiding principles is that teaching is a profession, right? And by that, we mean that, professionals are able to diagnose and solve problems. They have a vocabulary that they use. They have deep knowledge, and they can see what's happening. And that's why, it's only natural that new teachers are like, I've got this whole bag of tricks. I haven't yet put it all together in my head, because it's a profession. So I will just share, actually, my eldest daughter is going to become a teacher next year. She's graduating from college. So I'm so excited, but I'm also telling her it's a profession, right? And this is a lifelong journey of really of understanding your practice really deeply. And I think I make the point sometimes too, teaching is like non-invasive brain surgery on 25 kids at a time, right? And we need to understand how the brain works, because that's what we're doing. We are actually rewiring kids' brains, right? We're helping form new memories and form new connections, neural connections. And so that's what I think makes teaching so exciting too, is the depth of knowledge that's required of content, but also the whole process of learning too.
I love that you touched on that, because you do need to understand how the brain works in order to do this work. So what can a teacher learn from the brain-based model of lesson design and delivery from your book?
Yeah, and so here's how we thought about it. You start with the process of learning, and we actually know from cognitive science that new memories, it's a long and perilous journey that takes for information to go out there in the environment into deep long-term memory. Our brains are actually really good at a couple of things. One is ignoring stuff, because we have to, because our environments are so filled with stimuli that our brains are very good at just filtering things out. The other thing is our brains are really good at is forgetting stuff, which also helps us stay sane, because if you couldn't forget anything, you wouldn't you'd be so full of information you wouldn't know how to sort the important stuff out. So the brain-based model starts with this idea that learning begins when kids become interested. I've written elsewhere about the power of curiosity. When we're curious, we actually learn, we retain things better. We actually also find learning more joyful, right? When you have something you're curious about and you fill that gap, you get a little dopamine hit, right? So it starts with this idea of how can we design every learning opportunity, every unit around something that really captures kids' imaginations. And sometimes it's things like that are just maybe contrary to what you would expect. I'm here in Denver today. I was sharing, we had great weather this week, and it's because there's an interesting phenomenon that happens in Colorado when the wind is blowing out of the mountains. It's called Chinook winds, and things get warm in Denver. And you wouldn't think that, right? Because it's like, well, the mountains are cold. How is it warm? So that's an example of like the kind of thing that you can introduce to a kid and say, why would that be true? And then start to engage them in the science of what's happening with that. So we start with this notion of helping kids become interested in learning. And the book has lots of strategies, ways to do that, to really pique their curiosity. Once that's happened, then we also know that kids have to commit to learning. And here's why. Learning is like tremendous mental energy, right? It takes a lot of effort. And our brains always want to kind of revert back to low effort mode, right? So we only stay focused on learning when we can see why it's important for us, when we set a goal for ourselves, and we can see how to achieve that goal. So that's kind of the second phase, is helping them commit to learning. And there's all kinds of things in the book about, success criteria, but we also talk about the WIFM, which is kind of a Madison Avenue term. What's in it for me? Like, if you can't help kids understand why they should learn what's in a unit, why this is important stuff, how adults use this in the real world, how this can make their lives better, they're going to always be in their own minds going, why am I doing this? And that takes even more mental strain too. So Those first two phases kind of work together. You see they're both in the same color here to get kids kind of initially going, okay, this is important. I'll pay attention to it, and I'm going to keep paying attention to it. So that's the first phase.
I like the with them. I just want to put that out there. That is, I'm going to steal that one. We should, what's in it for me? That is so true. And that's adults, that's kids. Like, it's the why.
Yeah, yeah.
Why things unless you understand that. Thank you,
yeah.
Lisa.
No, and how many times, I mean, that sometimes is also where maybe you find yourself in Groundhog Day, Lisa, right? Like, why am I repeating myself?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, because the kids weren't really paying attention because they really can't understand why I'm doing this. And if your only answer for why we're learning this is because it's on the test, that's not a very gratifying answer for kids, right? Yeah. Some kids are like, okay, sure. But others like that, but then you can't answer as an adult why somebody somewhere decided this was important for them to learn. And I can think about some of my worst units. Probably Scarlet Letter, right? I couldn't explain why they needed to read the Scarlet Letter. I can do it now, but at the time, I think I was like, oh, Puritans are interesting. I had no idea. So I think that's so crucial to think about lesson design, unit design. What's in it for kids? All right. So now let's say, Kelly, we've got kids interested. They're on board. Now it's like, how do you get them to encounter the new learning? And there are times where it could be direct instruction, yes. But one of the big things that we talk about in the book that comes out of cognitive science is that it's called dual coding. And that we actually, as human beings, we can learn things faster when it comes to us both visually and verbally, right? Right now, you've got a visual on the screen, which helps, right? If I were talking and it was just that, I think it's a little harder sometimes to picture. So in classrooms, that can mean things like using non-linguistic representations or graphic organizers. Or we also know from empirical studies that one of the best things you can do is, if you're a math teacher, give kids here's a worked example of this problem, right? And now you go work your own so they can kind of go back and cross-reference. But that helps them process both visually and verbally. So we talk a lot in the book about how to focus kids on the new knowledge. And then with this caveat that after like 5 to 10 minutes, our brains start to tune out. We're like, okay, I've got too much in my head. Or we also know there's a limitation around like 7 plus or minus 2, probably 4 things, honestly. You can only hold 4 things in your head at once before you've got to stop and process. And some of you, by the way, if you're watching this video later, you might want to pause right now and go, I need to go back and review what was just said so I can process this. So, yeah. And then so that comes the next phase of making sense of learning, and it's connecting dots. And we know that actually the process of learning is always about neural connections. It's about taking a bunch of ideas and putting them into something I already know. Or this is where cooperative learning then fits in, right? Having kids in groups of 4 do, numbered heads together exercises where then you call on them later, or reciprocal teaching. And this is where also I think learning becomes a social activity, right? But sometimes initially it's best to maybe I read something on my own, or I hear something, and then I want to go, I'm just like probably some of you are right now, like I want to go talk to somebody about this and see what makes sense for me. So that's the 4th phase. Again, keep noticing how this is all about what's happening for kids, right? This is, yes, you're doing some things as a teacher, but most importantly, you're going, is this happening for my kids? Which can also help you avoid Groundhog Day. Like it may be that what happened is you've taught something, but they never made sense of it. So it didn't stick. And then they fell asleep at night and their brains do this thing where they weed out all the extraneous information, which might have included your lesson from the day before.
Right. I mean, if you put yourself in the seat of a student, maybe in middle or high school, who's going from classroom to classroom remotely, or when we are on campus, and they go to each one, then you're going to be, and if they're learning more than 4 things, like you said, it's all going to just be input into the brain. And that they have to have that scaffold built in.
How many times as a parent, Kelly, I've got my daughters are teenagers and then one, graduating from college, but, you'd ask them, what did you learn in school today? Like, it's like, well, the reality is they learned like 142 things. Yeah. But you can't remember any of them. And so I think that's also where we know the power of like at the end of a lesson, let's summarize, let's come back to what you've learned, which is also a part of a sense-making activity as well, like synthesizing what you've just heard and putting in your own words. That's also really a powerful way to make sense of learning too. So at this point, if you're thinking about what's happening in the learning journey, kids maybe have encountered something, but there's still a long ways to go before it gets into deep memory. And this is, I was thinking about, what Lisa was sharing around transfer and independence. this is where it becomes so important that kids can start to do some independent learning. We talk about practice and reflecting. And so practicing things and then seeing what don't I have figured out yet. Cognitive scientists call it discrepancy reduction. That's the fancy term, but sometimes it's just what you do with flashcards, right? You put the terms down that you haven't memorized, or that you've got memorized, and keep focusing on those things. But the most important piece after the practice and reflect is this final piece of extend and apply. Because what happens there is I've learned something, and now I go solve a complex problem, or I write a literary or a research paper on what I've learned. I connect it back to my own life. As you do that, you're making, as a student, a learner, more and more mental connections with what you've learned, and that connection now becomes stickier, and it's more in depth. And so those are like the 6 phases all put together. And I think the other part of this, then, Kelly, is like, it is about guiding kids towards that independent learning. It's not just dropping them off there and saying, go sort some stuff out. It's making sure they have enough of the base knowledge, the foundational knowledge, and now I can go apply it and make meaning of it in my own life. And so those are the 6 phases, kind of in a broad, very broad brushstroke. I probably just water skied over things we could scuba dive into, but.
Oh, that's a good metaphor. I like it. Wow, that is just so great to see that transfer of knowledge and how that can happen. I can't tell you how much it's exciting to see how that research and that 6-phase model aligns with what we're trying to ask Hyperdoc designers to do. Because in some of the language that you shared, we even have in our own template, starting with a Hyperdoc has to have an exploration first, where you build curiosity.
Yep.
So you kind of mentioned getting them, but beyond that, like the Hyperdoc can be designed, and then some people have some misconceptions that thinking that you just push that out in Google Classroom and it's self-paced and students do that on their own. Well, they need to be guided through it.
Makes sense, and all those things, and not have misconceptions. That's important too, right?
Right. Yeah. And they need to have that opportunity to collaborate and to practice and to take risks, because of the way that you've built in your lesson, that they can play with the material a little bit in the explore phase. You also mentioned that explain phase where, there is sometimes when you need to sit and give direct instruction, but be mindful of that as well, that it's not too much,
right.
Censor that piece, and then allow them to apply their learning in many, many different ways and extend the thinking. We also build in a lot of sharing and reflecting, and we have a Hyperdoc this is our template, on the right here, and it just goes really closely with this brain-based model that you're talking about. And even if you take a look at some of our examples, where the learning happens is not until the share, even down here. And I'm guessing this aligns with your thinking too, because how often have we made something or done something and we think, oh, I got it, I'm right. And then you see what other kids in the class did, and now you have a different way of thinking about it.
Right. Yeah.
When I was a student and we had a project, I would line up at the door with the project I did at home, feeling proud about it. And then you get to the school and you see everyone else's and you're like, oh, that would have been a good idea. That would have been a good idea, right?
Right.
So there's ways of embedding that to and that's the extent that I think you're talking about too.
Right. Or it might give students another angle, like, oh, when I go to extend it, I want to go that direction too, of how I've seen my classmate share something too.
Right. And what I love about your model is, and even the visual that you have, is that it's a cycle that I think you can always go through. Right.
That's a really good point. This is not linear. We know that learning is oftentimes, it is actually the only good learning is relearning, right?
Right.
Circling back to things. And so we don't want people to have that misconception that you just, go right through it, at once, because there is a lot of, keep building those building blocks that may be iterative process, and you keep reflecting on what haven't I grasped yet, that share idea. Okay, so clearly I got a misunderstanding there. I need to go back.
Right.
Yeah.
I love it. Okay, so when you have written the book and you spend time with teachers and you think about lesson design, what is something that you really, really hope to see when people design lessons?
I think it is honestly that last phase, Kelly, that extend and apply. And I think it's, it's Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins talking about beginning, with the end in mind, right? Planning backwards. And I think if you can step back and see, okay, my unit needs to have an extension application activity, and then that might help me think about, and so how are students going to demonstrate that they can extend and apply the knowledge? I think that gets us to performance assessments. It gets us to project-based learning, problem-based learning. Because I think too often, and I understand why it happens, because teachers feel like I've got this huge curriculum, pacing guide I got to get through, but they'll lop off that extension application, the culminating activity of a unit. How often is it just a summative test, right?
Right.
But John Medina makes this point, and we put it in the book too. If you've read Brain Rules, he talks about, kids forget 90% of what they learn in a classroom within 30 days. And it's often because they haven't made those deeper connections. And I understand there's accountability pressures. We got to, we want the kids to test well. But if they're forgetting 90% of what they're learning, you'll be better off going slower so they can actually learn things more deeply and retain what they've learned too. So I guess I would say that extension application activity, and it's not every unit, by the way. I mean, not every lesson. It's at a unit level, thinking about what the arc of your unit's going to be, can also help you then backward design and say, well, I need these lessons to build this foundational knowledge, so kids are prepared. They've got the tools in the toolkit to go solve this complex problem or whatever it might be, or science experiment or something.
Mm-hmm. What's exciting about your book is that it's really talking about learning, and you're still talking about assessment. And sometimes those don't always go together, and I know that your company works with educational leaders and like organizations. Are there any advice that you have around that? Because sometimes you hear teachers talk about feeling a little sad and frustrated about all the mandated testing that isn't necessarily measure learning. And the purists in all of us just want to learn and play with kids every day and create experiences for that transfer of knowledge and watch them design and create and be collaborative young humans. And especially with technology now, students don't need to wait until they're out of school to become little business owners, to design their own social media platform, to do things that are right at their fingertips. So how do you help organizations adopt these methods and practices?
Yeah, so it is focusing sometimes on this notion of performance assessments. We wrote a paper a few years ago about curriculum embedded performance assessments and how you can really see those as the true drivers. Like at times you have to move the goalposts. If your only goalpost is a standardized achievement test, that's not going to get kids where you want them to be those little business people or entrepreneurs, or just able to extend what they've learned into their own lives. And so we help people think about that. We emphasize curiosity, and curiosity kind of weaves throughout all 6 of these phases, right? That keep kids curious. We can point to schools that have focused on curiosity and focused on better teaching and learning. And then lo and behold, those test scores go up too, but not because they focus on the test scores, but because they focus on good teaching and learning. And so I think sometimes we also recognize that superintendents they have to, demonstrate performance to school boards and to, state agencies. But I think it's by saying, but if you can focus on just better teaching and learning, the other stuff will take care of itself, right? In fact, we first started picking up on this idea of curiosity in Melbourne, Australia, and some of those principles, they would tell their teachers, you worry about teaching and learning, I'll worry about the test scores. And as it turns out, the test scores, increased, but that wasn't the focus in the schools. It was having actually what some of these schools I've seen do. They have afternoon investigations. So the afternoons are all about extension application. The mornings are about here's the building block knowledge. Now let's go investigate. So that's some of our response back is let's focus on teaching and learning. I think the rest will take care of itself.
I love it. It's so true that if they are learning how to learn, then all of that transfer when the time comes, because there is a space for standardized assessment in most public education realms. So we can't not address that. But if we're focusing on learning to learn all the time, then that transfer would be transferable to that as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this has been so fun. I want to invite Sarah and Lisa to come back in because I know they're dying to ask you a couple of questions and to talk about the chat. And then we definitely want to show our audience a few more HyperDocs that will showcase the theory that you're in the research that's in your book.
Great.
I have to say, Brian, I'm just listening to you and processing the fact that your favorite part is like the end, right? It's the doing something with the learning. And in following your 6 phases, like, okay, if I've sparked their interest and if I've, introduced some new content or whatnot, and then it's like, do they get to do something with it? And like, that's our ultimate goal, but that's the part we move on to the next content, move on to the next standard, move on, And so if we've done that work ahead of time, like they'll want to stay and linger in some performance aspect. And I just kind of, Kelly and Lisa, just started quickly scanning some of our HyperDocs and just thinking about like the 6-word memoir HyperDoc and how the bulk of the time is spent in application. It's like first application might involve, I don't have the actual lesson pulled up. Maybe Kelly, you can click into that for me.
You want me to click on
the one on the far right? Yeah. But gosh, you just really have me thinking about where do I spend the bulk of my time as a teacher? We talk a lot about, the power of building that curiosity and exploring first, but you're really making me process, like in my instructional minutes or my time, how much time do I invest in allowing students to play with the content? And if you'll kind of scroll through this, the explore and the explain are relatively quick. Here's one application. Go ahead to the next slide, Kel. Where they get a chance to draft a memoir working with a partner. And then they go into the next layer of that application where it's like, okay, now do some of that application of learning on your own. You've had a chance to do oral rehearsal with a partner. Now do it on your own, do multiple drafts. And then the third application is go and create kind of that final piece. And so just in thinking about your emphasis on applying and extending just really made me think about this one in particular and how it really kind of walks the students through the application process, kind of to that goal of often on your own. These are some beautiful examples that have been But with something that can seem so simple, like, hey, choose 6 words to represent your life, seems easy. But if the application is extended and done in depth, that's where the kids, I think the bulk of the learning comes from. So what you shared is going to really stick with, it's going to stick.
No, and that's the kind of thing kids will remember years later. They may not remember that Romeo was a Montague, but they'll remember this, right? And how important, right? That they can almost, create a life motto. And that's a lot of the extension application phase is about making those personal connections to my life and what's meaningful to me.
Right. And you even mentioned the neuroscience behind those connections, and our brain, our neurons are making connections. And part of that is us connecting to in order for that to happen. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure
this is fabulous.
This is great. And another thing that I want to just give Sarah a shout out, as a classroom teacher, she did this lesson and it's been remixed many times because of technology has evolved. She even has a student who took this 6-word memoir activity, talk about sticky learning, who made this her life motto and is now like a senior or has graduated from high school.
Freshman in college.
She's in college. She has a website. Her 6-word memoir became her mantra through life. And she does service projects and does all of these things in the community, inspired by this lesson as a 5th grader.
Big shout out to, student Sarah. She, her 6 words, and it has stuck. It was be strong and give back happiness. And she's been through a lot in her life, and she continues to show strength and offer happiness to others. She has, that extension piece is something that you're also shining a light on today. And that's something else that we don't always build into our lessons. It's like, how do you extend this? And it can be sometimes just an invitation, she's just a good example of someone who has kind of really taken the invitation and run with it. But
here, Sarah. There's so many.
Yeah. Oh, these are
No,
just
these are
examples that have
fabulous.
just been thrown together. Yeah, this was another teacher who taught it. I didn't even teach the lesson. So it's just neat. That's the other value to designing these lessons. I mean, and the teacher could have delivered it a little bit differently.
Yeah.
But when you said apply and extend, this really stood out to me because it's got layers of the application.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, Sarah, I think you made another point too. I mentioned teachers being professionals. To have a common framework or a mental schema about how learning happens, it's much easier to share things, right? We can share lessons, and like what doctors would do by having a common vocabulary, they can gather around a patient and say what's happening, right? And so that's part of what we're also hoping is that a way to professionalize the profession is giving people common shared mental models of how learning works, and then common vocabulary. And it seems like that's also the magic of HyperDocs, right? That people can share lessons because they have this shared understanding about how we're designing these things, and where we're trying to drop kids off at, which is the deep understanding. Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned communities of practice. That's something that we wholeheartedly believe in too, because you can feel isolated in your own classroom. It's so easy to go in, shut the door, or especially these days at home,
Right.
And just how do we continue to establish and grow the communities of practice?
Yeah. Yeah.
About that, I have to say that one of my favorite people to collaborate with around this kind of learning is actually watching today. So big shout out to Kathleen, who's in the audience, because she has done a lot of work in processing. Together we process. She is the star of this video we've created about sticky learning with HyperDocs, and we talk a lot together. It's about that collaboration with teachers on lesson design, where you could take a lesson such as teaching commas and make it stick. Something where we're like, she's so brave, like to take what we may think about as the driest lesson ever for third graders and flip it on its tail and make it something that started to get to really the heart or the objective of what you really wanted.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, I need to teach comma rules, it's I need to start seeing commas show up in their writing. It's like that's the real objective. And so she turned this around based on that, what you were describing. That by the way, a lot of ahas when you put up your 6 steps and the template, because this is based off that template. But Kelly, at the very bottom where it says part 2 on this, because she started off with a lot of modeling this 5-minute fun. This is when the big aha happened with her students, and she's probably like shouting in the comments right now about this. And
Kathleen.
She made this chart with all the comma rules, and instead of telling the kids what the rules were, she had them go into their reading books and find commas. She just sent them on a noticing hunt, and they took photos and then underlined it using an app. And then their job was to get that little image into the chart and do a sort and put the comma under the correct rule. Now, my favorite part was when she came to the carpet with the kids and like, okay, so let's analyze what you put here. They were wrong. There were so many of them that were wrong. And it wasn't about that you had to memorize this, but that is where her portion of the instruction began. Right there, Kelly, stop right there. She could easily move their little images so that then she could align what you saw with the correct rule. And because it was theirs and they found it, from then on, she would describe to me that the students would say, oh, I found a dependent clause. And she'd be like, you're third grade and you're noticing this in your own reading now. Or when she would do a read aloud out loud in class, they would start to notice these things because they had to make that active connection in the work. So,
and Lisa, what you just described is that sort of flip the paradigm shift of like, it's not what I'm teaching, it's what's the enduring understanding I want kids to have, that they learn when they're 8 or 18, but they remember when they're 80, right? So like, and starting with kind of the success criteria, I want them to be able to put commas in their writing. That's what I'm trying to do. And then you design the teaching and the learning experience around. And I also love this idea of like kids' own discrepancies is where they can start to see, oh, I got that wrong. One of the practices we talk about too is the power of just ungraded quizzes, like retrieval practice, trying to like recall something. really can help solidify better learning is if you get the right answers immediately following, right? So,
Well, and I think
yeah.
it builds that efficacy for learning too, because they're not afraid to put their answers on that chart incorrectly in her classroom.
Right.
You know,
Right.
they know that, oh, okay, I see what I did there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's a really important skill to build with our students, so that they don't fall apart the minute that they get something wrong or they feel like they failed.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And
We talk about, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and it's a community of practice in a smaller way, right? Like all the kids are on one doc sharing, so they can learn from each other as well. You know, which is kind of neat when you I just keep thinking about that term, right? And here it is, they're doing it together.
Well, sometimes as teachers, we're working so hard, like, how do I create that? But I think the question might be, how do we step back and let the kids do more of the work than what we're doing? And how can I just facilitate that learning that way? I think that was what I liked about that lesson a lot.
I love that lesson so much, because I just think of the mistakes I made as an early teacher of passing out I called it the DLA, the sentences where they would come in the classroom. I taught third grade my first few years, and, you know, find where you need to put the comma. And it was just this skill and drill. Talk about, like, why are they not putting commas in their writing now? We do commas every day when they show up in the first part of the day. And then I would read their writing and the commas wouldn't be there. So, like, get rid of that and do that lesson that Kathleen did, where they're starting to see those and make meaning of that. And big shout out to, like, Teachers College and Reading and Writing Workshop people, because they taught us that shift in pedagogy as well, of how to really analyze and study text and what writers do as a reader in order to apply it in your own writing.
Right.
My dog is having
Mine may show up here unexpectedly too. No, and what I love about the example too, it's visual, right? The kids can visualize what they're learning, and it's also then verbal. Clearly, it's about ELA, but and this notion of that, I love that idea of failing forward, like practice. And you know, there are studies that look at, like, championship ice skaters. What did they do differently? They don't practice more, but they spend more of their practice time on the things that they're not good at yet. So that's the whole idea of failing forward. And it hurts, right, to fall on the ice, and it can hurt to fall down, you know, metaphorically, but to help kids see, like, but that's how we learn. It's all about relearning, you know. I love that.
Something that really struck me as you and Kelly were speaking, Brian, is the big aha around how much we're noticing during this teaching during a pandemic. And when you talked about the school in Melbourne and how they have that structure in the afternoon, and as we think about going to the physical school building, how can we bring in this study and this brain research into the structure that we teach within? I know a lot of teachers who try to build that into their instruction within the schedule they're given. But maybe schools could rethink the structure that they are, providing to help this along.
Yeah, you may have teachers that miss the asynchronous, the hybrid learning, like, because it's asynchronous time when we can do the transfer and independent learning, right? But make it structured so the kids know what they're supposed to be doing. But I think you're right. And the other thing is, like, if we can help kids during this time become more independent as learners, that's going to serve them well when they're back with us in person. But I do think it's going to require, probably at the unit level, rethinking some things. And maybe there'll be some rethinking of just even how we structure our schools, like the school I was talking about in Melbourne, where it was, by the way, that was all like team teaching. The teachers would come together, and the investigations were cross-curricular. So you learn your maths, as they say in Australia, in reading in the morning, but then we're gonna get into science and social studies and everything else in the afternoon.
Team teaching. I mean, we all need each other. The three of us started HyperDocs based on our love of lesson design and learned how to integrate Google Apps for Education. And then that's the community all around. And like you said, that's the heart of the work. Like that lesson, you get to make a lesson that brings that excitement. So,
and what's also like you guys, what they were doing in Melbourne is they would have, like, binders full of lessons, and then they would save the lesson from the previous year and come back to it. I think they were doing, like, multi-age classrooms. So 2 years later, they'd come back and they could look again and see what they'd done. But that way they weren't always reinventing the wheel either. The whole idea of sharing, and sharing across, schools even, right? I mean, that's what you guys are doing too, which is
Yeah.
We shouldn't have to reinvent the wheel 180 days a year, right?
Yeah. And it's fun to look at your old lesson design and reflect on where you were in your own.
Yeah. And sometimes, you know, you surprise yourself, I'm sure, like, that was pretty good. But other times, like, oh, geez.
Oh, man. It's like, sorry, kids. I'm going to step up now. Well, Brian, this has been absolutely delightful.
We a lot of fun.
Really, really appreciate your expertise and giving your time up on this Saturday morning to our little audience here.
I'm wearing my Saturday attire, my Mr. Rogers. I've turned out, you know, but, it's been fun to spend the morning with you guys too. So.
Well, thank you so much. And I want to encourage everyone who's watching to check out Brian's book. I'm going to drop the link in the chat right now. In fact, maybe we'll put it up there on the screen one more time, Sarah, so everyone can see it. Learning That Sticks, a brain-based model for K-12 instructional design and delivery. So yeah, there you go. You can hold it up too. Check that out, and then just enjoy. If you are a HyperDoc designer, like, see how what he is teaching you can be embedded into your lesson design. And I also ask you to let us know how it's going. If you've tried some of this out or you have some reflections, please share in our community how it's going. I also want to talk about our greater community of Teachers Give Teachers really quickly. As you know, HyperDocs.co, about 2 weeks ago, we reopened Teachers Give Teachers. It's back. We are so excited. Woohoo! So here is an free online database for you to go ahead and search for lessons, upload lessons. I have it on Looking for Science. That was the last time I was searching. You can search for anything there. And once you find a HyperDoc that you are wanting to try out, all you need to do is click on Preview, check out the HyperDoc, and then they will make a forced copy for you to have it in your drive. And then, of course, put your own craft and creativity on it, practice, revise it, remix it, make it work for your kids in your class. Think about who your learners are as you design that. So that's available as well for people to check out.
So when you think about WIFM, what's in it for me? The teacher version.
Local learning, right? That's what's in it for you. Yeah.
Exactly. Visit Teachers Give Teachers. Find something that's for you.
Yeah.
Go shopping.
Thank you guys for the great work that you're doing too. I'm so pleased that we've connected, and this has been a pleasure. So.
Yeah,
Thanks so much, Brian. Got a lot to think about today now.
I do too. I always learn so much. Okay,
the feeling.
Well, thank you all, and we will see you next month on our next Facebook Live. Until then, keep creating, keep sharing, and keep supporting each other. Have a great weekend.
Bye.